The crown's unease did not stem only from the new tax system shaped at Monzon. It was equally disturbed by the role the Assembly had begun to play in military affairs during the years 1362 and 1363. Père, who styled himself as the head of all his realms and territories, reluctantly accepted that the estates would take charge of collecting the subsidy. He even listened to their advice on the ongoing conflict with Castile, presenting this as a gesture of cooperation. What he did not anticipate was the degree to which the Assembly would move beyond finance and begin directing the war itself. From the king's perspective, this was no minor encroachment, but a direct challenge to royal authority. Command over the army had always been a core privilege of the crown, and the developments at Monzon struck at its very heart. When Père insisted that Parliament's responsibility ended with distributing the funds it had approved, the estates pushed back. They argued that money raised for war could not be separated from decisions about how soldiers were used. As a result, the deputies claimed the right to consult directly with leading military figures about troop numbers and deployment along the frontier. Commanders provided advice, but real authority rested elsewhere. It was the deputies who fixed wages, approved expenses, and issued a series of rules designed to ensure that every coin was well spent. Payment was not made to individuals, but to organized units. Heavy cavalry formations consisted of a knight, a mounted assistant, and 2 infantrymen equipped with stronger armor and a broader array of weapons. Light cavalry units were smaller, made up of a knight and 2 foot soldiers, all carrying lighter equipment. Because these troops were funded by parliamentary grants, the estates believed they had the right to regulate them closely, even though the soldiers answered to their own leaders in the field. Financial oversight remained the Assembly's primary concern. Determined to avoid waste, the estates insisted that the subsidy be used solely for military needs. Funds were to support active combat, the defence of fortresses, and the relief of towns under siege. Whenever money was spent on border patrols or naval forces guarding the coast, the same strict supervision applied. Commanders were granted limited freedom, but they were held legally accountable for crimes committed by themselves or their men while in service. Alongside fears of losing control over troops, the estates worried that large sums earmarked for war might be misused. To prevent this, they ruled that all knights sent to fight would be treated as equals. Uniform pay and standardized equipment eliminated disputes and simplified oversight. Only those whose names appeared on official rolls were entitled to wages, a measure designed to prevent substitutes from taking another man's place. Losses in battle were recorded immediately, and fallen men or horses were removed from payroll lists. Salaries were withheld until soldiers reached their assigned posts. Leaving without permission or failing to complete a term of service meant repayment of wages already received. This level of control provoked deep resentment among commanders and troops alike. Tensions grew further when the estates insisted that a share of all captured booty be redirected into the subsidy fund. Lawmakers viewed spoils of war not as personal reward but as another financial resource, one that could be used to pay wages and transport supplies. Military leaders saw this as yet another intrusion into long-standing custom. The Assembly did not stop at regulating pay and discipline. It went on to define acceptable standards for weapons and armour. Soldiers were required to arrive fully equipped, with detailed lists specifying what each type of cavalryman had to bring. Heavy cavalrymen were expected to carry padded garments, chainmail, and full knightly arms. Light cavalry were required to provide protective armour, helmets, shields, and lances. Equipment differences lay mostly in the level of protection afforded to horses and support troops. Inspectors were authorised to reduce or withhold wages from any unit that failed to meet these standards. The army itself reflected the social diversity of the realms. Clergy, nobles, and townsmen all contributed contingents. Noble commanders often led urban units into battle. To preserve cohesion, town representatives insisted that their soldiers fight under the banners of the communities that funded them. Transfers between units were allowed only with local approval. This reinforced the idea that military service remained tied to local identity rather than royal command. Supply lines along the frontier received special attention. Earlier campaigns had suffered from shortages and transport failures, worsened by forced confiscations of animals that were never returned. To avoid repeating this, the estates ruled that only registered pack animals could be used. Failure to return animals or compensate owners resulted in penalties imposed on the military units involved. Soon after issuing these detailed regulations, Père abandoned the assembly. He moved his court closer to the frontier, determined to confront his enemy directly. Monzon had been a humiliating necessity. Like other medieval rulers, Père believed that funding and directing war was a royal duty. Facing attacks on multiple fronts, he maintained a public image of strength and wisdom. Throughout the assembly, he presented himself as a just ruler, acting solely for the common good. He portrayed the war as a moral struggle against a dishonourable foe and framed parliamentary control of the subsidy as a generous concession. Behind this carefully crafted image stood a ruler whose patience steadily eroded. Month after month of debate produced little, at least in his view. The estates, he believed, were more concerned with their own privileges than with victory. By early 1363, his frustration boiled over. In a dramatic address, he accused the assembly of selfishness and declared that he would face the enemy with only a handful of loyal followers if necessary. Though exaggerated, the speech revealed his fear that parliamentary cooperation was hardening into political independence. In many ways, Pére's judgment was accurate. The assembly was not a unified body, but a collection of groups defending local interests. Loyalty to individual regions outweighed concern for the wider realm. These divisions were the product of long-standing royal policies that had favoured some lands and classes over others. The laws issued at Monzon reflected this fragmentation. They applied separately to different territories and estates, rarely binding the crown as a whole. Economic realities shaped taxation. Wealthier regions paid more, poorer ones less. Within each realm, social divisions were stark. Nobles and clergy worked together to reduce their burden, shifting costs onto towns. Collection methods exposed further inequality, placing heavier pressure on rural households. Even cities clashed among themselves, as powerful centres negotiated reductions, while smaller towns demanded equal treatment. In theory, the cautious and forward-looking decisions taken by the Assembly were meant to stabilise the royal war effort for at least 2 years. The intention was clear: to ensure continuity, discipline, and predictability in financing a costly conflict. In practice, this expectation quickly unravelled. The funds were exhausted far sooner than anticipated, forcing Père to return once again before parliamentary assemblies in 1364 and 1365 to request additional revenue in order to continue the struggle against Castile. Whether the strict financial rules established earlier were fully observed during these later collections remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that even as procedures shifted and exceptions emerged, the institutional structure created during these years did not fade away. Out of repeated financial crises and continuous negotiation between Crown and estates, a new governing body steadily took shape. Originally formed as a temporary mechanism to manage extraordinary taxation, this institution evolved into a permanent executive authority, tied directly to the assemblies of the realm. By the end of the century, it had secured an established role within the political systems of Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia alike. What began as an emergency response to war gradually transformed into a standing instrument of governance, reshaping the balance between royal authority and collective representation. The prolonged strain of the War of the Two Pedros did not alter financial structures only in the eastern realms. In Castile, the burden of sustaining warfare also forced major changes, though along a different path. There, responsibility for funding military operations rested firmly with royal administrators, rather than parliamentary bodies. Over time, this centralized model would gain influence across Iberia, especially after the dynastic union of the late 15th century. Even so, the experience at Monzon marked a turning point. It demonstrated that systems of taxation and fiscal control were not fixed constructions, but living frameworks, constantly reshaped by social pressure, political. Centuries later, echoes of medieval Iberia would still resonate in modern political language. In the early 21st century, references to the loss of Muslim Spain surfaced once more, framed as symbols of historical grievance. For many, the fall of Al-Andalus, and particularly the end of the Kingdom of Granada, continues to represent a deep sense of cultural and political loss. Yet such interpretations often simplify a far more complex past. Some religious voices have attributed Granada's downfall to moral decay, claiming that artistic refinement and cultural achievement distracted its people from faith and duty. This explanation, while emotionally powerful, fails to reflect historical reality. Granada's story is remarkable, not because it eventually fell, but because it endured for so long. Surrounded by stronger rivals and facing constant pressure, the kingdom's survival itself demands explanation. Granada's resilience becomes especially striking when examined against the turbulent backdrop of 14th century Europe. This period was marked by widespread instability, dynastic conflict, and prolonged warfare. In this environment, Granada managed not only to persist, but to navigate danger with notable skill. Central to this success was the relationship between Granada and its most persistent rival, Castile. The interaction between these two powers reveals much about how Granada adapted to shifting political landscapes and survived repeated external threats. At the centre of this story stands one ruler in particular. Mohammed V emerged as a figure of uncommon political judgment, guiding his kingdom through decades of uncertainty. His reign was defined not simply by survival, but by strategic restraint, careful diplomacy, and an acute awareness of when to resist and when to cooperate. His long tenure stands out within the history of the dynasty, not only for its length but for its effectiveness. Muhammad ascended the throne in the mid-14th century, at a moment when Granada had narrowly escaped annihilation. In the years that followed, he proved adept at maintaining the kingdom's borders, while avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible. His rule was interrupted early on by violent internal struggles, a familiar pattern in Granadan politics. Assassinations, palace coups, and betrayals were common, often carried out by close relatives competing for power. After being forced from the throne, Muhammad eventually returned with external support, reclaiming his position through military force. What followed was an unusually long period of internal stability. This absence of major internal upheaval was not merely a political success. It became a foundation for broader prosperity. Artistic production flourished, trade expanded, and Granada's reputation grew well beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Stability allowed culture and economy to reinforce political survival. The kingdom Muhammad governed had inherited a tradition of pragmatic realism established at its founding more than a century earlier. From its earliest days, Granada had relied on flexible diplomacy, shifting alliances, and careful use of limited resources. Direct confrontation with stronger neighbours was avoided whenever possible. Instead, survival depended on exploiting rivalries, negotiating truces, and responding quickly to changing circumstances. Demographically and militarily, Granada was vastly outmatched by Castile. Its population was small, its resources limited. Yet in the fragmented political world of medieval Iberia, constant conflict among kingdoms created opportunities as well as dangers. Borders shifted, alliances broke and reformed, and no single power was able to dominate the peninsula for long stretches of time. Within this unstable environment, Granada endured. The rulers who preceded Muhammad V had to navigate an Iberian political landscape that was already crowded and increasingly unpredictable. New forces entered the scene from beyond the peninsula itself. From their base in North Africa, the Marinids established a lasting presence in Iberian affairs, maintaining strategic positions for nearly a century. Their involvement altered the balance of power and added a further layer of uncertainty to regional politics. At various moments during the 14th century, the peninsula also became a theatre for broader European rivalries. Forces connected to England, France, and the papacy arrived to support or oppose one or more of the Iberian kingdoms. Alongside them came professional soldiers for hire, whose loyalty depended less on cause than on payment. Even those who welcomed such forces as allies often found them dangerous and difficult to control. During the first half of the century, control of the Strait of Gibraltar became one of the central issues shaping diplomacy between Granada and its neighbours. Castile, Aragon, and North Africa all viewed this narrow passage as a strategic prize. Massive armies gathered in the region on several occasions, turning the surrounding lands into staging grounds for international conflict. Gibraltar itself became a focal point of repeated military efforts, culminating in a failed Castilian siege in the middle of the century. At the centre of these campaigns stood Alfonso of Castile, an energetic and forceful ruler who pursued territorial expansion with renewed determination. Granada was his primary objective. Not since the great conquests of earlier centuries had Castile been led by a king so committed to warfare. Alfonso's strategy combined military aggression with careful diplomacy. He sought to block North African intervention in Iberian politics, while securing permanent control over the strait. To achieve this, he set aside internal disputes, forged alliances with other Iberian rulers, gained the backing of the church, and recruited experienced warriors from beyond the peninsula. As Gibraltar appeared close to surrender, Alfonso's ambitions expanded even further. His sudden death from the plague ended these plans abruptly. With him died both the campaign against North Africa and the prospect of a final assault on Granada. After Alfonso's death, the momentum of Castilian expansion quickly dissipated. The siege of Gibraltar was abandoned, and his teenage successor chose negotiation over continued warfare. A peace agreement with Granada effectively brought a decade of sustained military pressure to an end. This decision was taken despite signs that Granada's external support was weakening. Political instability in North Africa and strained relations among Muslim powers might have offered Castile a favourable moment to strike. Instead, restraint prevailed. By this time, the North African empire that had long supported Granada was unravelling. Cut off from meaningful external assistance and ignored by distant allies, Granada appeared dangerously exposed. Yet collapse did not follow. Rather than falling, the kingdom entered what would later be seen as its most remarkable era. Pedro of Castile's reluctance to attack Granada remains one of the enduring puzzles of his reign. Later generations judged him harshly, remembering him as a violent and unpredictable ruler. His reputation might have been very different had he achieved a decisive victory over Granada. Instead, his reign became associated with internal bloodshed and accusations of favoritism toward religious minorities. Some have suggested that this perceived sympathy explains his restraint toward Granada. While such claims contain elements of truth, they do not fully account for the situation. A more convincing explanation lies in the diplomatic skill and adaptability shown by Granada itself. The personal trajectories of Pedro and Muhammad reveal striking similarities. Neither was the favoured heir of his father. Neither enjoyed the unchallenged support of the royal household. Both came to power suddenly at the same young age, and both saw their authority challenged by ambitious relatives. Each was forced into exile under humiliating circumstances. Restoration came only through reliance on foreign allies, whose support was far from assured. These shared experiences suggest a level of mutual understanding that went beyond formal diplomacy. Pedro's early reign was marked by immediate internal tension. Members of his step-family sought to secure their position by forming alliances with powerful nobles, attempting to influence the structure of the new court. Pedro responded decisively. He moved quickly to curb these ambitions, relying on force rather than negotiation, and surrounded himself with advisors whose loyalty aligned with his own interests. Other challenges compounded these political struggles. The plague had devastated Castile, draining its population and damaging its economy. In response, Pedro convened an assembly to approve measures aimed at stabilizing finances and easing social strain. These efforts reflected a broader concern with restoring order after years of upheaval. Foreign policy added another layer of complexity. Castile was surrounded by the rivalries of Europe's great powers. Maintaining neutrality during the conflict between England and France required careful balance. Toward the end of Alfonso's reign, Castile had leaned toward France, sealing this alignment through a royal marriage. What appeared to be a diplomatic success soon turned into a personal and political disaster. The failed union became a source of scandal, distracted Pedro for years, and weakened Castile's international standing. The next phase of Pedro's reign marked a clear shift from the policies followed by his father, and this change worked decisively in favour of his Muslim neighbours. Rather than continuing pressure on Granada, Pedro turned his full attention elsewhere. With remarkable focus, he committed Castile to a prolonged conflict against Aragon, a struggle that would last for a full decade. This decision granted Granada an extended period of relief, one that proved both profitable and strategically invaluable. War between Iberian kingdoms was nothing unusual during the Middle Ages. Borders were fluid, dynastic marriages produced overlapping claims, alliances were fragile, and personal ambition often outweighed long-term stability. Historical grievances, whether real or imagined, could easily spark violence. When Pedro declared war on Aragon in 1356, nearly all of these factors were at play. In this climate, religious difference between Castile and Granada mattered far less to him than political rivalry with a Christian neighbour. Fighting began in earnest the following year. Castilian forces achieved early successes, prompting both sides to agree to a temporary halt in hostilities. While this pause was formally brokered with outside mediation, it opened the door to a wider diplomatic reshuffling. The Aragonese king sought support beyond Iberia and secured neutrality agreements with both North African and Granadan rulers. In return, he pledged that Aragon would not assist Castile should Pedro turn his attention toward Muslim lands. This agreement reflected a long-standing pattern of cooperation between Aragon and Muslim powers across the Western Mediterranean. These arrangements were not accidental. Granada, North Africa, and Aragon recognized that their economic and strategic interests often aligned. Protecting maritime trade routes and limiting Castilian influence served them all. The deepening rivalry between Castile and Aragon during the latter half of the 14th century offered Granada a valuable opportunity. By navigating these divisions carefully, the kingdom delayed and weakened the pressure that might otherwise have led to its conquest. For Granada and its North African allies, the outbreak of war between Castile and Aragon was welcome news. Relations between the two Muslim states briefly improved, and diplomatic envoys were exchanged. Some voices urged Granada to abandon its obligations to Castile altogether, arguing that Christian disunity created a rare opening. This advice was rejected. Granada's ruler chose a more cautious course, maintaining workable relations with all neighbouring powers. This ability to balance competing interests would become one of the defining features of his long reign. When the truce between Castile and Aragon collapsed, Granada openly assisted Pedro, though in a limited and carefully calculated manner. A small number of warships were provided, and Castilian fleets were allowed to resupply at Granadan ports. These actions technically violated earlier agreements, but stopped short of full military commitment. Plans to send ground forces never materialized. Events within Granada soon overtook all such intentions. By the summer of 1359, Pedro had assembled a formidable naval force and launched an ambitious campaign along the Mediterranean coast. Barcelona endured days of assault before the Castilians moved on to nearby islands. Initial successes proved fleeting. Upon learning that an Aragonese fleet was approaching, Pedro withdrew rather than pressing his advantage. No decisive naval battle followed. Within weeks, the fleet was disbanded, having achieved little at great expense. In the months that followed, Pedro retained the ability to strike decisively. His armies remained strong, and his position at sea was far from weak. Yet opportunities slipped away. Money, effort, and prestige were spent without securing a lasting advantage. By the time peace was concluded, the war had produced frustration rather than triumph. Pedro's conduct during this period invites difficult questions. Why divide forces across multiple fronts? Why abandon pressure at moments of apparent advantage? Why avoid a naval confrontation despite superior strength? One possible explanation lies not in Aragon or Castile, but in the political upheaval unfolding within Granada. Throughout the conflict, Granada's ruler had supported Pedro, albeit cautiously. Assistance was symbolic, rather than decisive. Even if larger forces had been committed, they would have represented only a fraction of Castile's military strength. Granada appeared determined to preserve its resources and avoid becoming deeply entangled in another kingdom's war. This careful strategy was interrupted abruptly by internal crisis. In late summer, Granada's ruler was overthrown in a palace coup. He escaped across the straits and found refuge in North Africa. His successor ruled only briefly before meeting the same fate. Power then passed to a new ruler who radically altered Granada's foreign policy. Under this new leadership, Granada abandoned its cooperative stance toward Castile. Tribute payments ceased. Military assistance was redirected toward Aragon. Evidence suggests that this shift was not coincidental, but part of a broader realignment encouraged by Castile's enemies. For the first time in years, relations between Castile and Granada deteriorated sharply. Despite these developments, Pedro initially refrained from intervention. He neither exploited Granada's instability nor renewed his offensive against Aragon. A peace agreement was signed instead. Earlier Granadan support for Castile had been limited in scope, and its withdrawal did not fundamentally alter the military balance. Granada's leaders appeared unwilling to exhaust their strength on behalf of others. This raises an important question. To what extent did events in Granada truly shape Pedro's strategy? The timing suggests caution. His withdrawal from naval operations preceded the coup. Friendly relations were maintained with Granada's interim ruler. Only when the new regime firmly aligned itself with Aragon did relations collapse entirely. At that point, the fragile balance that had preserved Granada's security began to unravel. The papal envoy sent to broker peace between Pedro of Castile and Per of Aragon urged both rulers to put aside their rivalry and unite against Granada. Neither king accepted this proposal. Despite the political upheaval in Granada following the recent coup, Pedro chose to pursue a course shaped by his own priorities. Granada by itself did not pose a serious obstacle to Castilian ambitions in Aragon. Yet the growing closeness between Granada and Aragon could not be ignored. The possibility of cooperation between these two powers carried strategic implications that Pedro understood all too well. While living in exile in North Africa, Muhammad found himself unable to persuade his host to restore him to power by force. His most realistic hope lay in securing Castilian backing. Pedro, for his part, assumed the role of defender of legitimate rule in Granada and made it his objective to place Muhammad back on the throne. Achieving this goal required the removal of the reigning emir Bermejo, but first Pedro had to convince the ruler of Fez to allow Muhammad to leave his refuge. Initial hesitation on the part of the North African ruler faded when Pedro issued a credible threat to attack the remaining Marinid positions in Iberia. This pressure worked. By late summer, Muhammad was on his way back across the straits. A Castilian fleet awaited him, tasked with escorting him safely to the peninsula. This show of force was deliberate. Pedro wanted it understood that he was prepared to act decisively. The North African ruler not only yielded but also provided naval support of his own, allowing Muhammad to launch an assault against Bermejo. Land forces were committed as well, marking a temporary alignment with Castile. Bermejo responded by seeking assistance from Aragon, requesting ships to counter the growing naval threat. Granadan vessels clashed with Castilian ones as alliances shifted rapidly. North African involvement, however, proved short-lived. A series of internal coups destabilized Fez, removing first one ruler and then another. By the time Pedro renewed hostilities against Aragon, a new claimant occupied the throne across the straits, further weakening coordinated intervention. Efforts to remove Bermejo were complicated by differing expectations. Accounts from Muslim and Christian sources diverge on what was promised in exchange for Castilian support. One version suggests that Muhammad pledged little more than lasting peace with Castile. Another claims that he agreed to surrender territories whose inhabitants did not immediately rally to his cause. If this latter version holds any truth, it reveals a ruler confident in his popularity and secure in his position. Muhammad's reliance on Castile deepened after the withdrawal of North African forces. Joint operations began early the following year. In a surprising turn, Pedro temporarily set aside his hostility toward Aragon and sought assistance there as well, though promised support appears never to have arrived. By the end of the year, Pedro commanded a sizable army. Early successes were followed by a serious setback when a Castilian force was ambushed while plundering a city believed to be abandoned. Despite this, the campaign continued. Several towns fell under Castilian control, and Muhammad achieved a notable victory with the surrender of Malaga. Facing mounting pressure, Bermejo attempted a personal appeal to Pedro. Whatever expectations he carried into this meeting were quickly dashed. After a formal reception, Pedro ordered his execution. By the spring, Muhammad had reclaimed the throne of Granada. beginning a second reign that would prove far more enduring than the first. Upon his return, Muhammad adopted a carefully calculated foreign policy centered on stable relations with Castile. Pedro appeared content with this arrangement. Although Castilian forces occupied portions of Granadan territory, no effort was made to retain them permanently. Instead, Pedro redirected his attention back to Aragon. For Granada, the renewal of conflict between its two powerful neighbours brought a sense of relief. When Pedro had first mobilized against Granada in support of Muhammad, his army included foreign knights drawn by ambition and religious zeal. Dreams of conquest and personal advancement blended easily with claims of spiritual purpose. After the campaign ended, Pedro renewed ties with these leaders and expanded his network of alliances. New agreements were forged, and by the summer of 1362, coordinated attacks were launched against Aragon from multiple directions. Initial gains were impressive, with several towns falling under Castilian control. By year's end, Castilian forces stood near Valencia itself. These advances, however, proved fleeting. Upon learning of the Aragonese king's approach, Pedro withdrew. Castilian fortunes soon faltered. A naval attack ended in disaster when a sudden storm wrecked Pedro's ship, nearly costing him his life. The middle of the decade saw intense diplomatic maneuvering. Alliances formed across borders, drawing the Iberian conflict into a wider European struggle. Aragon aligned with France, Castile with England. The war expanded beyond local ambitions, gradually pulling Castile into the broader conflict that engulfed much of Europe. Pedro's objectives shifted dramatically. Territorial ambition gave way to the struggle for survival. A coalition took shape against him. Aragon sought to halt Castilian expansion. Pedro's half-brother aimed to claim the Castilian crown. French interests pursued both revenge and naval advantage. Muhammad remained publicly loyal to Pedro, resisting repeated attempts to draw Granada away from Castile. At the same time, he acted cautiously. Aware of the scale of the coming conflict, he strengthened defences and quietly secured alternative alliances, in case Granada became the next target. When Pedro's position collapsed, Muhammad moved swiftly. Agreements were signed with his former allies' enemies, and advantage was taken wherever opportunity arose. In the winter of 1365, a large mercenary army entered Iberia from the northeast. Funded by France, the papacy, and Aragon, it advanced deep into Castile. By spring, Pedro's rival was proclaimed king. Pedro, encamped with his own army and supported by Granadan cavalry, chose flight over confrontation. The invaders advanced unopposed, staging a symbolic coronation. Grand promises were made, including the gifting of Granada itself, gestures meant to secure loyalty rather than reflect reality. As the mercenary army marched south, Muhammad faced renewed danger. Pedro's favoured city descended into chaos as unrest spread. Accusations against Pedro multiplied. His enemies portrayed him as hostile to Christianity, greedy, and dangerously aligned with Muslims. Whether true or not, such claims proved effective propaganda. They helped unify opposition and justify intervention. Muhammad's loyalty, however, was never unconditional. He supported Pedro only so long as it served Granada's interests. As chaos spread, he turned to his own priorities. Appeals were made to Muslim rulers for support. Defensive measures were strengthened. Strategic positions inside Castile were seized. Towns and fortresses, previously lost, were reclaimed. Facing threats from multiple directions, Muhammad navigated another crisis at home. With rival armies approaching and naval forces threatening the coast, he confronted internal rebellion. Recognizing the shifting balance of power, he reached out to Pedro's rival. offering submission in order to preserve stability. His actions were framed as necessary to protect harvests and prevent further unrest. Concern for Granada's survival guided every decision. As alliances shifted once more, Muhammad secured agreements with neighbouring powers, pledging neutrality and withholding support from Castile. Through caution, adaptability, and decisive action, Granada endured yet another storm in an age defined by war and uncertainty. Pedro, meanwhile, secured the support he needed from abroad. After careful negotiation, he convinced the Black Prince to commit a major army to the effort of restoring him to the Castilian throne. In April 1367, the opposing forces met at Nájera. Pedro's side, reinforced by the English, won a decisive victory. Enrique escaped and fled across the border, but the result was clear. Pedro was king again. Almost simultaneously, events in southern Iberia unfolded in a way that suited Granada. Muhammad, still active in the region, achieved a success of his own near Seville. At Utrera, his forces struck hard, burned the town, and carried off a substantial haul, including large numbers of captives. It was a brutal reminder that even while Christian factions fought each other, Granada remained capable of acting swiftly and forcefully along the frontier. In the months that followed, Pedro faced the familiar problem that had shadowed his rule again and again: money. The English intervention had not been free. He needed to refill an exhausted treasury, repay heavy obligations to his allies, and manage the continuing complications of civil conflict. During this period, relations between Pedro and Muhammad improved once more, returning to a pattern of practical cooperation. Yet, Muhammad did not stop exploiting Castile's instability. Later, in 1367, Granadan troops moved against Jaén, a city that had broken with Pedro. From the outside, the campaign could be framed as assisting Pedro against rebels. At the same time, Muhammad presented his actions differently to Muslim audiences, emphasizing motives tied to honor, retaliation, and the wider struggle on the frontier. This difference in interpretation became a recurring feature of the period. Christian observers often suggested that Pedro tolerated or even encouraged Granadan operations, feeding accusations that his closeness to Muhammad harmed Castile's interests. Granadan narratives, by contrast, portrayed these expeditions as justified responses to earlier attacks and humiliations. After another success in the borderlands, Granadan troops joined Pedro's forces at Casariche. Together they turned toward Córdoba, a major city that had declared for Enrique and continued to resist Pedro even after the defeat at Nájera. The combined army was immense by medieval standards. Estimates vary widely, but the concentration of cavalry and infantry was clearly formidable. Even so, the siege produced little. Córdoba endured. The defenders held out through repeated assaults, while heavy rains flooded the attackers' camp and disrupted operations. The spectacle of power did not translate into a breakthrough. By the end of 1368, Muhammad had used the Castilian civil war to recover territories that had been lost earlier in the century. Fragmentation inside Castile opened doors that would have been sealed in more stable times. Still, Muhammad did not abruptly abandon Pedro. Support continued at least until the final crisis. In early 1369, Pedro faced Enrique again. His army included thousands of lances and a significant Granadan cavalry contingent. In raw numbers, Pedro's force was comparable to, and possibly larger than, that of his opponent. Yet numbers did not decide the outcome. At Montiel, Pedro was outmaneuvered and deceived. Reinforcements expected from Granada and from the south failed to arrive in time. Pedro fell into Enrique's hands, and on the night of March 13th, 1369, he was killed. Victory did not bring immediate peace to Castile. Support for the fallen king persisted in scattered pockets. Enrique, though triumphant, inherited a kingdom burdened by debt and surrounded by hostile neighbours. Portugal, Aragon, and Navarre turned against him for their own strategic reasons. Under this pressure, the new ruler had little strength to spare for a sustained campaign against Granada. Muhammad recognized the opening and refused to accept easy reconciliation. Instead, Granada aligned itself with Enrique's enemies, coordinating with North African partners and reaching agreements that strengthened its position. In the summer of 1369, Granadan forces captured Algeciras. From there, pressure expanded into other towns and strategic points across Andalusia. Castile, weakened by internal division and external threats, struggled to respond. Eventually, both sides acknowledged the danger each posed to the other along the frontier. In May 1370, Enrique and Muhammad agreed to a long truce. Renewed and extended over time, it remained in place until Enrique's death, nearly a decade later. Around the same period, Muhammad also acted across the straits, intervening in North African politics in ways that stirred unrest among rival powers. The resulting distraction served Granada's aims. Gibraltar, long contested and symbolically important, was retaken. For the remainder of his reign, Muhammad continued to work the same advantage again and again: the weaknesses and rivalries of neighbouring kingdoms. Over a quarter-century of conflict had shaken Iberia. At various moments, Granada could have been crushed, either by a determined Castilian monarchy acting alone, or by international forces arriving under the banner of wider religious war. Yet the fatal blow never came. The most striking point is not that Granada eventually fell centuries later, but that it survived as long as it did under constant threat. The kingdom endured not through sheer strength, but through negotiation, tactical restraint, selective aggression, and the careful balancing of alliances. Muhammad V's long reign captures this pattern. His approach did not rely on a single decisive victory. It relied on reading the political weather, avoiding unnecessary risks, striking when opportunities appeared, and making peace when survival required it. These habits of statecraft helped keep Granada intact for generations beyond his lifetime. One of the less obvious consequences of the long war between England and France was the steady movement of English soldiers into Italy. Periods of truce left thousands of experienced fighters without employment, and many crossed the Alps in search of wealth, status, and fresh opportunities. After the peace agreement reached in 1360, this flow increased sharply. Among those who arrived was a formidable force that soon gained an enduring reputation: the White Company. This band emerged from an earlier mercenary group that had devastated large areas of southern France and created serious problems for the papal court at Avignon. Seeking to remove the threat, the Pope redirected the company toward northern Italy, placing it in the service of an ally locked in conflict with the ruler of Milan. In this way, a problem was exported rather than resolved. Foreign mercenary forces were nothing new to Italy. The peninsula had long hosted such groups, known locally as companies of adventure. German mercenaries had been active there for decades, and English fighters had appeared in smaller numbers even earlier. What made the White Company different was not its foreign origin, but its effectiveness. It quickly gained a reputation as a highly disciplined and devastating military force. Over time, its story attracted the attention of writers and admirers who often described its exploits in dramatic and romantic terms. This fascination shaped later perceptions, turning the company into a legend rather than a clearly understood historical phenomenon. Despite its fame, surprisingly little is known about how the White Company actually functioned. Basic questions remain unresolved. Its internal structure, the origin of its name, the tactics it favoured, and the reasons behind its repeated success are still debated. What follows attempts to shed light on some of these uncertainties. Whatever later admiration inspired, the company's first actions in Italy were marked by extreme violence. Upon entering the Piedmont region in the spring of 1361, its soldiers burned villages, assaulted civilians, mutilated captives, and spread terror across the countryside. Contemporary observers described systematic cruelty. Prisoners were tortured to force ransoms. Bodies were left mutilated as warnings. Even by medieval standards, the brutality stood out. Italian chroniclers reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some described the soldiers as unmatched predators. Others accused them of grotesque excess. The outrage was heightened by the fact that these acts were initially committed not against enemy territory, but against lands belonging to a ruler who was officially neutral. Responsibility for this situation lay largely with the employer, who had directed the company into these regions for his own advantage. Yet alongside condemnation, admiration emerged. Italian observers were struck by the soldiers' readiness for war. These were not inexperienced fighters. Unlike many mercenaries who came from minor noble backgrounds and had seen little real combat, the men of the White Company were veterans of major battles. They had learned warfare through sustained conflict, rather than tournament ritual. Writers of the period remarked on this transformation. The English, once regarded as marginal warriors, were now seen as relentless and battle-hardened. Chroniclers emphasized their endurance, their ability to move quickly across difficult terrain, and their indifference to hardship. Comparisons were drawn with ancient armies, and metaphors of predatory animals appeared frequently. The company's reputation for intimidation became as important as its actual battlefield performance. At the same time, observers noted another quality: cunning. The White Company was praised, not only for strength, but for maneuver, deception, and strategic flexibility. This combination of aggression and calculation made it especially dangerous. The image that emerged was of a force able to terrify opponents while outthinking them, a balance that would later be celebrated as an ideal of military leadership. Determining the company's exact composition is difficult. The most reliable surviving evidence comes from a contract drafted late in 1361, months after the company had already entered Italy. Earlier agreements no longer exist, and during this initial period the band's membership shifted constantly. Soldiers moved in and out, some leaving for other employers, others arriving from Northern Europe. Additional recruits were sent south at the Pope's request. Commanders split off with their followers to sell their services elsewhere. The surviving contract nonetheless reveals important details. Leadership rested largely in English hands, even though a German mercenary was listed as overall commander. Beneath him stood a group of officers, most bearing English names. Contemporary writers consistently referred to the company as English, and official documents use similar language. The men themselves represented a broad cross-section of veterans from the wars in France. Some names can be linked to known campaigns and commanders. Others remain obscure. Many soldiers likely used assumed names, a common practice among men seeking to escape past crimes or failed loyalties. In several cases, identification remains uncertain and speculation replaces certainty. One figure, however, stands out clearly. John Hawkwood appears in the contract under a form of his name consistent with English records. At this stage, he was not the leader of the company, but an officer of rising importance. His later fame would eclipse that of the company itself, Yet here he appears as one among many, albeit listed prominently enough to suggest elevated status. Other officers attracted attention for different reasons. Some were mistaken for commanders by chroniclers. Others became notable for personal traits rather than military skill. Beauty, youth, and noble lineage could capture as much notice as battlefield success in the accounts of contemporaries. The contract provides no explicit figure for the company's size, forcing reliance on narrative sources. Estimates vary widely. Some suggest several thousand mounted soldiers accompanied by infantry. Others give lower numbers. A more careful comparison with later records suggests a force numbering somewhere in the middle range. Even at the lower end, the company was larger than many of the towns it initially confronted, especially in sparsely populated alpine regions. Any numerical estimate must remain tentative. Medieval armies rarely displayed uniform organization. Individual officers commanded contingents of vastly different sizes. The White Company was no exception. Its numbers fluctuated constantly, shaped by recruitment, desertion, death, and disease. Plague struck northern Italy, just as the company arrived, causing heavy losses. Contemporary observers noted moments when its strength was drastically reduced. Turnover was high. Only a small fraction of the names recorded in the early contract reappear in later agreements. The White Company was not a static body, but a shifting organism adapting to circumstance and opportunity. Its power lay not in permanence, but in experience, cohesion under pressure, and a reputation that preceded it wherever it marched. A surviving agreement drawn up late in 1361 described the band as a great company of English and Germans, yet the reference to Germans appears more symbolic than factual. It likely served to acknowledge the German captain at the top, rather than to describe the rank and file. Everything else suggests that Englishmen dominated the force. That imbalance helps explain one of the most striking lines in the contract. A promise that the company would not take up arms against other English groups or against subjects of the English king if such men arrived in Lombardy. This type of pledge was not unique to the White Company. Similar clauses appear again and again in English military agreements throughout the century. What stands out is how specifically the loyalty is framed. Comparable wording is far harder to find in contracts involving other nationalities, even though German and Hungarian soldiers often showed their own forms of solidarity. Why English documents stated the principle so openly remains uncertain. It may reflect the way prolonged war had sharpened a sense of collective identity among English soldiers, not only as comrades in arms, but as men tied to a crown and to a shared political world. At the same time, this clause did not mean a blanket refusal to fight fellow Englishmen. The company still promised faithful service to its Italian employer against enemy forces, even if those enemy forces included English contingents. The line was drawn in a very specific place. Fighting Englishmen was acceptable if they were not serving the English crown. In other words, loyalty was directed upward toward kingship rather than outward toward nationality alone. In the service of Pisa, the company kept doing what had first made it feared in the north. It moved fast, hit hard, and left little time for its targets to react. Night operations remained central to its style. One town was taken before dawn, while most of its residents were still asleep in their own beds. Speed and surprise continued to do much of the work. When a fight in open ground became unavoidable, the same battlefield habit appeared again. The men dismounted. Accounts from the period describe a small early clash near the Florentine frontier where a compact English group ran into German mercenaries. The English started to step down from their horses and set themselves into a defensive stance. waiting for the other side to commit first. The maneuver was not completed. One German rider charged suddenly, catching men while some were still mounted and off balance. Several were knocked down in a few moments, a couple were killed, and the English pulled back. The incident was remembered less for strategy than for the sheer audacity of the charge, precisely because such personal bravado was considered rare. The war between Pisa and Florence posed a larger test than what the company had faced earlier. The theatre was bigger, the stakes higher, and the towns more heavily defended than many of the smaller places it had bullied in Lombardy. Even so, the pattern remained familiar. Fields were burned, villages stripped, and local life disrupted until whole districts felt unlivable. Contemporary observers described fighters who seemed never to rest, always moving, always searching for the next weak point. Yet much of the company's reputation was built without frequent set-piece battles. At first, Florence avoided direct confrontation. Instead of meeting the invaders head-on, officials cleared supplies from exposed areas, pulled civilians behind walls, and tried to deny easy plunder. Only later did Florence attempt a more active defence, and it was then that the company scored its two most important successes of the campaign, taking Figline and then Incisa. Figline fell through a blend of fear and betrayal. A population already shaken by raids allowed the company inside. Once secured, the town became a forward base, a place to store loot, rest men, and launch strikes against nearby strongpoints. From there, raids spread outward towards smaller castles and vulnerable routes. The next move brought the company to Incisa. There, a Florentine force was beaten, and a portion of the senior leadership was forced into surrender. Descriptions of the fight are frustratingly thin, even from writers who lived through the war. Mentions of arrows and stones appear, along with repeated praise for English aggression and skill. Even so, blame for the defeat is often placed on Florentine weakness, rather than on enemy genius. What many observers emphasized most was the profit extracted afterward. A captured participant listed what was lost in a single breath: horses, weapons, supplies, valuables, without offering a clear picture of how the clash unfolded. Another local chronicler reduced the meaning of the encounter to a simple conclusion: the English walked away richer. During the winter of 1363 and 1364, the company entered a new phase. John Hawkwood rose to command. Around the same time, Pisa dismissed much of its other hired manpower and leaned heavily on this single force, treating it as the core of its army. Why Hawkwood moved up is not entirely clear, nor is it obvious how the earlier leadership absorbed the change. What is easier to see is that the shift planted tensions that would later break the company apart. In the beginning, Hawkwood's command did not look unstoppable. He launched his first major offensive during a bitter winter, when roads were difficult and the cold punished both men and animals. Observers admired the nerve it took to campaign in such conditions. Using familiar methods, Hawkwood seized a town under cover of darkness. But the offensive stalled soon afterward. Mountain routes proved hard to cross, supplies were scarce, and the push toward Florence became unsustainable. The force reached a fertile region northeast of the city, then found itself unable to stay there. The retreat cost men and horses. The episode suggested that boldness, one of the company's most celebrated traits, could also turn into overreach. After that winter setback, Pisa strengthened the army with a large German contingent led by a famous commander. On paper, the combined force looked overwhelming. When it advanced in spring, the march was fast, destructive, and confident. Fields were ruined as the army moved. Resistance brushed aside, and the threat reached the very edges of Florence. Florence responded in a way Italian warfare often encouraged: money. A payoff, delivered with theatrical ingenuity according to some accounts, triggered collapse from within. The German troops deserted. Much of the English followed, including several prominent officers. John Hawkwood did not. He stayed with Pisa. That decision earned him a reputation for loyalty that endured long after the campaign itself faded. In a bitter twist, the deserters, not Hawkwood, kept the famous name. A later agreement shows the White Company label attached to the English, who had crossed over to Florentine service. Yet in their new role, the group struggled to function as a unified force. It fought in a major victory alongside German allies, then, almost immediately fell into a nasty feud with those same Germans. Resentment flared, camps were attacked, and officials had to separate the national groups to prevent the alliance from tearing itself apart. When the Pisan-Florentine War ended, a wider pause in northern Italian conflicts left mercenary bands free to wander and plunder. Leadership among the English deserters shifted, and the group drifted south. Meanwhile, the earlier German commander and the former captain associated with the original company aligned themselves with a new German formation. Italy, now, had multiple roaming armies, each hungry for pay and profit, each willing to burn a countryside that refused to finance them. Late, in 1364, these rival forces collided near Perugia. One local account claimed that the Germans scattered the English with hundreds of early hand firearms, weapons said to punch through armour. If true, it would represent a remarkably early moment of effective gunfire on an Italian battlefield. The problem is that this dramatic claim cannot be firmly supported elsewhere, and the supposed breakthrough did not immediately transform warfare. Firearms would not become routine on a large scale until later. After pushing the English back, the German force entered papal lands and threatened key towns. That danger pushed new employers into action. The Pope and a powerful ally hired the English band as protection. A contract from early 1365 suggests the company expanded again, swelling to a massive mounted force under its current commander. Then the cycle repeated. Employer and soldiers fell into dispute. The Pope dismissed the English and turned instead to the Germans. That decision set up a final confrontation. The last major clash came in summer 1365, again near Perugia. The Germans defeated the English once more. As usual, accounts give few clean tactical details, but one factor is clear: logistics. Food, forage, and even water were denied. Without supplies, the English could not operate. The company surrendered. A letter survives in which the defeated men describe themselves as impoverished and imprisoned. Wording that captures both desperation and a sharp awareness of how quickly fortune could turn. Many of the captured were released within days, but prominent leaders were held much longer. One remained in confinement for about a year. Others did not regain freedom for several years. The defeat effectively ended the White Company as the famous, coherent force that had once dominated northern Italy. Its original commander was later killed in a city uprising. Several English leaders eventually returned home after release. John Hawkwood stayed. While others disappeared from the Italian stage, he remained and rebuilt. In time, he became the central figure among English soldiers in Italy, shaping new bands, new contracts, and a new model of mercenary leadership. Later writers sometimes use the old famous name when speaking of his forces, but the continuity was mostly symbolic. In contemporary language, Hawkwood's men were simply described as English companies. Under Hawkwood, the reputation of English mercenaries in Italy reached its peak. Early mistakes did not define him. Over the next decades, he became the leading hired captain on the peninsula, not only among foreigners, but among everyone in the mercenary world. When he died, Florence honoured him publicly, burying him in its cathedral and marking his memory with a grand painted tribute. That kind of recognition was rare for a professional soldier of fortune. The White Company itself vanished, but its influence lingered. Strip away the romance that later writers wrapped around it, and what remains is a clear pattern. Discipline, brutality, cleverness, and a ruthless ability to adapt. Skills learned in the wars of the North were brought into Italy, then reshaped to fit local realities. When longbow numbers were limited, other archers were recruited. When daylight assaults were risky, night attacks became a signature. The company was not invincible. Denied supplies, it broke. But for a crucial period, it changed the expectations of Italian war and prepared the ground for Hawkwood's long, dominant career. In 1357, London's mayor, aldermen, and citizens wrote directly to King Edward III to ask for something very specific: a renewed confirmation of the city's old privileges. They did not present it as a simple legal request. They framed it as a bargain already paid for in full. For roughly 3 decades, they reminded the king London had carried a heavy share of the kingdom's wartime load. Money had flowed out of the capital in loans, gifts, and taxes that reached a staggering total of more than £130,000. Men had also gone out in armed groups to serve on campaigns across a wide arc of conflict, from Scotland to the great theatres of war on the continent, including the long pressure of Calais and fighting connected to threats from Spanish forces. The message behind the letter was clear. That claim can be tested because London left behind unusually rich civic records. They preserved the practical details of how a medieval city turned its population and its wealth into soldiers, ships, cash, and emergency defences. In these pages, the war effort does not appear as a single dramatic moment, but as a repeated sequence of decisions and burdens. Council meetings, quotas, lists of names, arguments over payment, preparations for invasion, and the daily costs of keeping men equipped and willing. The documents also reveal something harder to measure, but equally important: the mood of the city as it was asked again and again to support distant wars. Beneath the formal language of obedience and service, there are hints of resistance, fear, pride, and exhaustion. Before the reign of Edward II, London rarely stood at the centre of English warfare. Earlier centuries do contain occasional snapshots of townsmen showing up in battle, though not always with glory. Royal demands on the city certainly existed, yet they often focused on supplies rather than large bodies of fighting men. When Henry III laid siege to Bedford Castle in the early 13th century, he called for a small group of crossbowmen from London and pressed the city's officials to provide practical equipment: rope, pickaxes, and an enormous stock of crossbow bolts. Skilled labour was required too, with carpenters hired to travel and build siege devices. These details matter because they show the kind of relationship that existed at the time. London could be made useful, but it was not yet treated as a regular engine for mass mobilisation. The reign of Edward I did not immediately transform that pattern. London did raise armed men when the realm felt threatened, as happened in the late 13th century, when fears of a French landing pushed the city to assemble forces for coastal defence. Even then, however, London's role often resembled logistics, more than field warfare. The city helped feed and supply military action, while its direct fighting contribution remained limited and inconsistent. Everything sharpened after Edward II suffered defeat at Bannockburn. That disaster raised the stakes of the Scottish War and exposed the Crown's need for wider support. From that point forward, London faced more frequent demands for soldiers and assistance, not only against Scotland and France, but also in moments of domestic unrest. Yet the relationship was not always smooth. At times, London responded slowly or sent fewer men than expected. The king's irritation can be sensed in his complaints. The numbers were short, the arrangements unclear, and the city appeared less committed than in earlier days. Behind the royal frustration lies a simple truth about wartime governance. Kings could demand, but cities still had to organise, pay, and persuade. When that machinery dragged, royal anger followed. Under Edward III, London's military role became more regular and more ambitious. Early in his reign, the city supplied mounted men-at-arms and an equal number of foot soldiers for a Scottish campaign. Beyond official contingents, private organisation also played a part. A London tradesman could gather a substantial group of men and lead them as contracted fighters, showing that military service was not only a civic duty, but also, for some, a path of opportunity. Over the next 3 decades, London repeatedly supplied the crown with armed groups, sometimes small, sometimes very large, and it also contributed vessels for naval service. The scale could swing dramatically from one demand to the next, reflecting the shifting needs of war and the crown's changing plans. The records show how complicated mobilization was inside a medieval city. Troops did not simply appear because a letter arrived from the king. London's leaders had to meet, argue, plan, and meet again. They had to settle who would serve, what they would be paid, how long the service would last, and how the city would gather money fast enough to equip and send men out on time. That process could take several rounds of discussion, because it touched nearly every sensitive nerve in urban life: labour, wealth, order, and fairness. Recruitment worked in more than one way. Sometimes officials directly selected soldiers using committees and boards to choose names and then requiring the men to assemble at the Guildhall, to swear obedience and accept the terms of service. On other occasions, commanders were paid to recruit a set number of men, after which a broad committee of civic leadership approved the final selection. In another method, the burden was spread across the city's wards. Each ward was assigned a quota based on its size and prosperity, so the richer wards supplied more fighting men, while smaller ones supplied fewer. In practice, this turned the city into a grid of obligations, with local communities responsible for producing bodies for war. Once a ward's quota was fixed, it still had to decide how to meet it. A ward might pool money and collectively outfit its required men. Or it might push the responsibility onto wealthy residents, ordering them to provide soldiers at their own expense. This second approach produced a paper trail that reads, almost like a ledger of personal responsibility. Lists of who provided whom, who still owed men, and what fines awaited those who failed. In some cases, a single household supplied multiple soldiers. In others, men served themselves rather than sending substitutes. Behind each entry lies a private calculation about cost, loyalty, risk, and reputation. The structure of these contingents also emerges from the documents. Large groups were commonly organised into hundreds with appointed leaders, and then broken down into smaller units under subordinate captains. Some leaders returned again and again across different campaigns, suggesting a pool of men in the city who accumulated practical experience in command. If recruiting men was difficult, paying for them could be even harder. Sometimes the Crown promised to cover costs, but London often found itself paying anyway, either because reimbursement was uncertain or because the immediate expenses could not wait. The city relied on two main financial strategies. One was to pressure the wealthy to provide funds as loans or gifts. Lists survive of individuals who advanced money, in sums that ranged from moderate to substantial. The other strategy was wider and more intrusive. A general tax assessed across the population and administered through the wards. Residents were evaluated, their goods estimated, and their share extracted. In theory, this system spread the burden. In practice, it also spread anger. That tension surfaces vividly in an episode where a man refused to pay his portion and ended up imprisoned. While held, he did not simply stay quiet. He reportedly spoke publicly, claiming many others felt the same resentment and suggesting violent action against the city's richest men. Whether the threat was realistic or exaggerated, the moment reveals the pressure inside the capital. War funding was not just arithmetic. It could become a flashpoint, turning civic unity into suspicion and class hostility. Once funds were collected, the city spent them on the full range of military necessities. Wages were the largest expense. Pay varied by role. Archers earned modest daily rates. Mounted light cavalry earned more, and men-at-arms earned more still. Captains and mounted elites received much higher sums. The city sometimes added bonuses, handing out extra money as a gift to boost morale or reward service. It also provided gifts that were not coin at all, such as wine distributed to the troops before departure. Clothing and equipment demanded large outlays. The city purchased cloth in bulk and had it sewn into matching garments with hoods, often in bright colours that made the men visibly identifiable. Red gowns and green hoods appear in the records, as do coats with striking colour patterns for archers. Weapons were purchased too, including lances that were likely intended for leaders. Standards and pennons were bought so the contingent could march and fight. The same records that explain how troops were raised also preserve the names of many who served. Muster lists survive for several campaigns across the period, and another list captures Londoners who served in a privately organised mercenary force. Together, they preserve hundreds of names, enough to see patterns rather than isolated stories. Some later commentators dismissed these soldiers as little more than apprentices and journeymen, implying the city sent amateurs. The lists, however, complicate that easy judgment. A significant number of men served more than once. Some appeared in 3 campaigns or more. One man's name recurs across every listed expedition in the early sequence, shifting roles as needed. When London sent smaller detachments, they were often packed with veterans, men who already knew the discipline and danger of campaign life. Yet the method of recruitment mattered. When a contingent was built through personal obligation, with householders providing men, the force could include more family members and servants and fewer experienced fighters. In that situation, the war effort blended into private life. A father might send a son, a master might send a servant, a group of neighbours might share the cost of a single mounted man. In other cases, individuals served themselves, perhaps because the obligation could not be avoided, or because the social value of service outweighed the risk. Even outside official civic contingents, London offered many doors into military service. The city was tied to the navy through the port. Ships went out with large crews, and the hiring of sailors and armed men could draw heavily from the local population. Londoners also formed contracted units under their own leaders, receiving significant pay for fixed periods of service. Some men in these groups had already served before, showing a crossover between civic levies and professional soldiering. For a portion of London's population, war was not an occasional duty, but a repeated occupation. Later in the century, fewer of the early veterans reappear on later troop lists. That shift may reflect several realities at once. Men already serving elsewhere, the effects of age and injury, and the demographic shock of plague. In a city where illness could cut through neighbourhoods and trades, a missing name might represent death as much as retirement. The documents also allow brief glimpses into the lives behind the names. Some soldiers appear only once, vanishing after a single campaign. Others resurface as jurors, witnesses, property holders, or figures in wills, leaving faint footprints that connect military service to everyday urban life. Trades and professions appear across the lists, not only servants and labourers, but also skilled craftsmen and men who moved in civic circles. At least one soldier was a physician, likely valued for obvious reasons. Yet many of these men do not show up in tax lists that captured the city's richest households, suggesting that the bulk of those who went to war were not drawn from the very top of London's wealth. They were not necessarily poor, but they were rarely the city's elite. In a few cases, the record becomes personal enough to show consequences. A soldier could be wounded and left permanently disabled, and the Crown might grant a small daily allowance as compensation. Even then, that man could still possess property and leave provisions for religious foundations, showing that military hardship did not always equal financial ruin. For others, war and violence intertwined in darker ways. Several soldiers appear in records because they were accused of crimes, or were connected to disorder in the city. Some had reputations as troublesome figures, described as well-dressed and reckless with money, drawn to nightly trouble. Others carried criminal histories long before they marched out with a contingent. The most dramatic cases involve murder accusations followed by flight and later pardon granted in exchange for military service, a practice that turned the king's need for manpower into a bargaining tool of justice. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine London's soldiers as a crowd of criminals. Medieval crime records are incomplete and uneven, and only a small fraction of the hundreds of named soldiers appear in connection with serious offences. The more useful conclusion is subtler. Soldiers moved through the same streets and tensions as everyone else, and military service did not separate a man from the roughness of urban life. Sometimes it even amplified it, bringing weapons, habits, and rivalries back home. London's contribution did not stop with men on land. The city also mattered as a source of ships and crews. Its position as England's leading port made it essential for ferrying troops and supplies and for providing armed vessels when the Crown demanded them. One account of a major naval battle even singles out a London ship arriving during the fighting and doing notable service. Civic records confirm that outfitting ships was expensive and detailed work involving wages for officers and crews, repairs, rigging, and provisions. When the Crown asked for large numbers of men at sea with long provisions, London negotiated, petitioning for reduced requirements. Even when numbers were reduced, the city still equipped men with protective gear and the sort of armament expected for sea warfare. The port's shipping, however, had limits. Many London vessels were relatively small and could not carry large complements. By contrast, some royal ships based at the Tower carried far more men. This imbalance forced London into a practical solution, hiring larger ships from elsewhere to meet quotas while adding whatever it could from its own harbour. The result was a patchwork fleet, where London's financial and administrative role could outweigh its direct shipping capacity. Money, of course, remained central. Sometimes London offered cash instead of troops, essentially buying out the requirement to send mounted men by handing over a set sum. The city also advanced large loans to the Crown, which might be repaid through subsidies drawn from other regions or through complex financial arrangements. At times, London imposed assessments on residents above a certain wealth threshold, extracting funds described as part gift and part loan. Even more significant were royal taxes that drew heavily on the capital's commerce. Wool subsidies and large military levies brought in immense sums. London's own 1357 letter gives specific figures for major campaigns, including the heavy costs a few years earlier during the struggle in the Low Countries and the prolonged siege of Calais. The tone implies frustration as well as pride. Many loans were still not repaid, and yet the city kept giving. The Crown also borrowed directly from individual Londoners on a vast scale. Hundreds of lenders appear across the reign, most of them providing small sums only once or twice, but a smaller circle returning repeatedly. A handful became regular financiers of war, advancing money again and again in amounts that ranged from minor contributions to enormous loans. This was not just personal generosity. It was a system binding wealthy urban finance to royal strategy, and it could be profitable, risky, or both depending on whether repayment arrived. War also threatened London directly. The city had to defend itself when invasion seemed possible, and the early years of the long conflict with France produced a particularly intense moment of fear. Rumours spread that an enemy fleet was gathering. A raid on the south coast made those rumours feel real. London's leaders responded with practical urgency. Warning beacons were established in key locations, so an approach could be signalled rapidly to surrounding regions and to the capital. The Guildhall became a centre of decision-making as large meetings settled emergency measures. Guards were posted day and night on walls and along the riverfront. Gates were assigned fixed numbers of men depending on the hour, and heavy missile weapons were set in place with ammunition ready. Along the Thames, the city tried to control access by driving massive piles into the river so that ships could pass only in restricted ways. A fortified structure was raised near the tower as a strongpoint and storage site for additional artillery and large stocks of missiles. Financing these works required loans and special assessments, which reached not only private owners but also major religious institutions and prominent households. Defence was treated as a shared obligation, even if the burden fell unevenly. Inside the Guildhall, the city also kept a new kind of weapon and supplies for it, including lead shot and stores of powder. The exact form of these weapons is uncertain, but their presence signals a transition in urban defence, a city beginning to incorporate emerging technology alongside older devices. London also organised a special internal force responsible for safeguarding the city during crisis. The names recorded for this body are revealing. Rather than drawing primarily from men with combat experience, the list leaned toward those already tied to civic administration and local authority. Many were involved in tax assessment and recruitment. A notable portion would later become aldermen. Many were wealthy enough to appear in tax records. This was less a militia of veterans and more a security structure rooted in status, governance, and the ability to command cooperation. As invasion fears faded, some defensive works were dismantled, but the pattern did not end. The long war meant recurring threats at sea and along coasts, and Londoners could be harmed even far from home. Merchants faced attacks by enemy raiders and private forces. Ships could be seized, crews killed, and survivors imprisoned in foreign strongholds. War reached into trade routes and personal fortunes, turning commerce itself into a battlefield. Finally, London expressed its wartime identity through public ceremony. Victories were marked with processions and religious display, with relics carried through the streets as the city tried to give meaning to distant fighting. Some celebrations were elaborate, especially when royal figures returned. With captured nobles, streets and buildings were decorated with flags and bright displays. Mounted escorts gathered outside the city. A triumphant procession could last hours, carefully staged, to project power unity, and the idea that the city shared in the glory of the crown. Across these decades, London became the clearest example of a broader shift in England's military system. Edward III drew more heavily than earlier kings on the resources of towns, demanding men and ships from many communities. Yet London's scale and wealth made it the most valuable contributor. It supplied soldiers in repeated waves and furnished naval support when required. It raised and transferred enormous sums through taxes, loans, and forced contributions, often with repayment uncertain or delayed. It organised defences when invasion seemed possible, paying for artillery, barriers, guards, and emergency command structures. And it maintained civic order under the strain of war, even as plague and loss hollowed out parts of the population and deepened poverty. By 1357, when London asked for confirmation of its privileges, the city was not speaking as a passive subject. It was speaking as a partner that had paid in coin, labour, fear, and lives. The letter's argument rested on a hard record of service carried out during years of campaigning and crisis, including a period when disease tore through the city and reduced its strength. In that context, the request for privileges was presented as something earned, a recognition due to a city that had repeatedly mobilized itself for the survival and ambition of the realm, while holding up an image of order that it claimed set a standard for the rest of England. In the autumn of 1355, the English heir Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, set out from Bordeaux at the head of an Anglo-Gascon force numbering roughly 5,000 men. As governor of Guyenne and one of the most experienced commanders of his generation, he launched a deep raid into the territories of the Count of Armagnac. This campaign would become one of the most destructive mounted raids of the entire 100 Years' War. Remembered not for a decisive battle, but for the scale of devastation it unleashed. Like most such raids, the expedition was not aimed at capturing territory or holding ground. Instead, it sought to burn, plunder, and destabilise. As the army moved eastward through Armagnac lands and into Languedoc, one city inevitably drew attention. Toulouse stood at the centre of regional trade and communication. It controlled the only bridge over the Garonne River capable of supporting an army and guarded the routes leading toward the wealthy Mediterranean cities. Any force hoping to move south or east could not ignore it. Responsibility for stopping the advance lay with Jean of Armagnac, commander of the Valois forces in the region. He possessed more troops than the invading army and had both political authority and military obligation to resist. Yet instead of meeting the English in the field, he chose a defensive strategy. The countryside was abandoned. Villages were left to burn. Resources were sacrificed in the hope that fortified places might hold. Toulouse itself prepared for the worst. Buildings outside the walls were torn down to deny shelter to attackers. Defensive works were strengthened. Bridges across the Garonne were destroyed, except for the one protected within the city walls. As October drew to what followed was not a heroic confrontation, but something far more unsettling. The Black Prince had no intention of besieging a major fortified city. Instead, he executed a bold maneuver. In a single day, his army crossed both the Garonne and the Ariège rivers, south of Toulouse, using fords believed impossible for cavalry. The waters were deep and fast, yet the crossing succeeded. French forces had not even guarded the river banks, convinced that the rivers themselves were sufficient defence. Observers recorded the shock this caused. The English commander showed open contempt for his opponents, describing them as paralysed by fear and unprepared for action. No attempt was made to challenge the crossing, even as English patrols ravaged the surrounding countryside and scouts probed the city's defences from the south. Other accounts offer a different perspective. Inside Toulouse, the population reportedly rushed to man the walls and gates. Local militias organised by neighbourhood and trade prepared to march out and fight. Yet Armagnac forbade it. He argued that untrained townsmen would be destroyed in open battle and that the only rational course was to remain behind the walls. Whether this decision reflected sound military judgment or aristocratic disdain for urban fighters remains open to interpretation. The English army continued southeast, leaving a trail of destruction through Carcassonne and Narbonne. Armagnac's forces remained inactive, waiting for reinforcements that never arrived. When the English finally withdrew, crossing the same dangerous rivers without opposition, the French commander still refused to engage. Only after the invaders were safely beyond reach did he attempt limited harassment, retreating whenever the English turned to face him. The campaign ended as a clear English success. The raiders returned enriched and confident. Their enemies were left impoverished, humiliated, and shaken. Within Toulouse, anger boiled over. Reports describe citizens attacking Armagnac's men left behind in the city. The psychological damage ran deeper than the physical destruction. The true significance of the campaign lay not in burned fields or looted towns, but in memory. For the first time in over a century, Toulouse had faced the reality of open war. Its people watched enemy campfires from their walls. They followed the progress of invasion through smoke on the horizon. The experience left a permanent mark. Fear of sudden attack would shape the city's behaviour for generations. The lesson was unmistakable. Toulouse could not rely on regional commanders or royal armies for protection. From that moment onward, the city understood that survival depended on its own preparations. A new phase of urban military history began. Though large campaigns would rarely approach the city again, the possibility of danger never disappeared. Toulouse remained on constant alert, prepared to act independently in defence of its interests. This transformation was not unique. Across France, many cities were forced into similar roles. Walled urban centres, capable of sustaining themselves militarily, became increasingly important. These cities came to be known as the great towns of the realm, places that could defend themselves and support royal power while pursuing their own priorities. Understanding Toulouse offers insight into this broader pattern. What did warfare look like at the urban level during the late Middle Ages? How did cities adapt to a world where violence was frequent but often indirect? What role did urban centres play in the gradual transformation of warfare and state power? Toulouse provides a clear answer. Over 2 centuries of conflict, the city demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and strategic awareness. It was not merely a victim of war, but an active participant shaping regional power. To grasp this role, the broader context of war in southwestern France must be considered. Long before formal declarations between English and French kings, the region was defined by territorial disputes and noble rivalries. The outbreak of open war in the late 14th century intensified conflicts already underway. For Toulouse, the war can be divided into 3 broad phases. The first stretched from the opening campaigns to the disasters of the 1350s, ending with the Treaty of Bretigny. During this time, royal defeat left cities dangerously exposed. The second phase was marked by instability, broken truces, and mercenary violence that lasted for decades. The third began in the 1440s, when royal reforms finally restored. In the early years, Toulouse played a limited role. It served as a logistical hub, supplying arms and men to campaigns elsewhere. Raids along the frontier heightened concern for local defence, but the city itself remained untouched until the mid-century crisis. That crisis changed everything. Plague and famine had already weakened the city when enemy forces pushed deep into the region. Toulouse declined challenges to battle, but acted decisively to obstruct enemy movement, destroying bridges and forcing withdrawals. Later, threats prompted alliances with powerful regional figures, when royal leadership proved ineffective. The deeper cause of devastation lay not simply in foreign invasion, but in internal rivalries. Conflict between regional magnates created a landscape of perpetual instability. The Great Raid of 1355 succeeded in part because neighbouring lords allowed it to pass, calculating that a rival's suffering served their interests. After the defeat of French forces at Poitiers, chaos followed. Armed bands roamed freely. Toulouse itself remained secure behind its walls, but trade collapsed and agriculture suffered. The city found itself surrounded by violence it could neither defeat nor ignore. Over decades, the greatest threat came not from royal armies, but from mercenary companies. These forces lived off the land, extorting payment and spreading fear. Toulouse responded pragmatically. When resistance was impossible, negotiation followed. Payments were made to secure withdrawal. Alliances were formed when necessary. The goal was survival, not glory. At times, the city openly defied royal authority, aligning with regional powers who could provide immediate protection. Such choices carried risks, including fines and political pressure, but they also preserved stability when alternatives failed. Gradually, royal power reasserted itself. Military reforms introduced permanent forces and reduced reliance on mercenaries. New systems of recruitment improved discipline and effectiveness. Toulouse became an administrative centre for these changes, supplying men and resources without sacrificing autonomy. The walls of Toulouse tell this story in stone. Rebuilt after decades of neglect, they consumed enormous resources. Taxes were levied. Emergency labour was conscripted. Materials evolved from earth and timber to brick and stone as technology advanced. The result was a fortress capable of withstanding early modern warfare. These defences were not symbols alone. They guaranteed security and justified the city's refusal to accept a permanent royal garrison. Armed citizens guarded their own walls. Night watches expanded. Militias organised by district ensured readiness without risking internal disorder. Despite possessing manpower, Toulouse rarely sent large forces into the field. Its strength lay in defence, logistics, diplomacy, and finance. When military action beyond the walls occurred, it was limited and carefully calculated. This restraint reflected experience. Armed mobs could threaten civic order as much as external enemies. Maintaining balance was essential. The city preferred negotiation to confrontation, payment to destruction, and influence to force. Throughout the war, loyalty to the French crown remained consistent, though often pragmatic. Support was offered when necessary. Resistance was mounted when demands exceeded capacity. Political alignment shifted when survival required it. By the mid-15th century, the transformation was complete. Toulouse was no longer a frontier city at risk of devastation. It had become integrated into a modernizing monarchy, contributing resources efficiently and defending itself effectively. When massive royal armies passed nearby in later centuries, they no longer threatened local life. Systems were in place. Cooperation replaced chaos. The city's long investment in defence and administration had paid off. Toulouse's story reveals how urban communities shaped the evolution of warfare and state power. Modern armies and centralised authority did not emerge solely from royal ambition. They were built through negotiation with cities that demanded security, autonomy, and respect. Toulouse was never a sovereign state, nor did it seek to be. Yet its capacity to choose how and when to deploy its resources made it a decisive force. Through careful strategy, it protected its people, preserved its privileges, and helped shape the political order that followed the 100 Years' War. One of the central responsibilities of medieval rulers was the defence of the lands they governed. In Catalonia, this obligation became firmly defined from the 12th century onward through a long-standing legal tradition. The duty of collective defence was embedded in customary law and was understood as a responsibility shared by all inhabitants when the territory faced external danger. This obligation applied broadly, regardless of social rank, and extended across the entire principality. The defence system was activated when the land itself was threatened. In such moments, all able-bodied men were expected to respond. Whether they belonged to the royal household, the nobility, the clergy, the towns, or the countryside. This system differed from feudal military service, which relied on personal obligations between lords and vassals. It also differed from royal musters, limited to lands directly controlled by the crown. Instead, this form of mobilization reached into every jurisdiction, including noble and ecclesiastical lordships. What made this system distinctive was its universal scope. Once activated, it overrode local privileges and allowed royal officials to summon forces, demand payments in place of service, and impose penalties on those who failed to comply. Because of this sweeping authority, any attempt to modify or negotiate its application usually required formal agreement in a representative assembly. Over time, this mechanism came to be seen not simply as a custom, but as a royal prerogative. Legal scholars of the later Middle Ages consistently affirmed that the ruler could activate it at will, without needing approval from representative bodies. By the 14th century, this defence obligation had become a powerful tool. It allowed the crown to raise forces across the entire principality, even in territories outside direct royal control. Royal officials could gather troops, collect funds instead of service, and enforce discipline through fines and penalties. This authority gained particular importance during a period of escalating military pressure and financial strain. Throughout the 14th century, Catalonia faced repeated threats from outside forces. Foreign armies, mercenary companies, and rival claimants crossed its borders during moments of wider European conflict. Each crisis tested the effectiveness of traditional military obligations. While the system promised universal mobilization, in practice it often produced large numbers of poorly trained and poorly equipped men who strained local resources without significantly improving defence. By the 1360s, these weaknesses had become impossible to ignore. The rising cost of warfare, the increasing presence of professional soldiers, and the growing complexity of military operations exposed the limits of mass mobilization. Rulers needed trained fighters, reliable equipment, and steady funding. At the same time, representative assemblies sought to limit arbitrary demands on communities and individuals. The crisis reached a turning point when large mercenary forces began moving through the Pyrenean regions. Their movements were unpredictable, their numbers substantial, and their impact devastating. Villages were burned, supplies seized, and entire districts destabilized. Faced with this danger, the ruler attempted to activate traditional defense measures repeatedly. But the results were inconsistent and often disappointing. In response to mounting pressure, a major assembly was convened in Barcelona in 1368. Initially focused on other political issues, the gathering quickly shifted its attention to the immediate threat posed by foreign troops approaching Catalonia. The ruler sought once again to call out the population under traditional defence obligations. The representatives resisted, arguing that experience had shown such mobilizations to be ineffective. They pointed out that many of those summoned lacked training, proper weapons, or discipline. Rather than strengthening defense, they often consumed supplies and caused disorder. A new solution was proposed. Instead of requiring everyone to serve in person, the obligation would be transformed into a structured contribution. Communities would provide a fixed number of soldiers based on household counts, or pay money instead. These funds would then be used to hire trained and properly equipped fighters. After extended negotiation, the estates agreed to this approach. The agreement established clear rules. For every set number of households, one soldier would be provided. If the numbers did not divide evenly, the remaining obligation would be paid in cash. Infantry would be organised into defined categories, with specific equipment requirements and daily wages. Communities would be responsible for meeting their quotas, while appointed officials would oversee recruitment and payments. This arrangement marked a significant shift. Military service was no longer a direct personal obligation for most individuals. Instead, it became a collective financial responsibility managed by towns and villages. Recruitment moved away from spontaneous musters toward planned organisation. Payments replaced presence, and professionalism replaced sheer numbers. Despite its promise, the system faced serious challenges. The danger passed temporarily when negotiations prevented an immediate invasion, and the new arrangements were not fully tested at first. But within months, foreign companies returned, advancing deeper into Catalan territory. Villages were attacked, fortresses threatened, and royal forces scrambled to respond. The defence system was reactivated under the new terms. Officials were ordered to collect funds quickly and hire soldiers without delay. Communities were given options to provide cavalry instead of infantry, using conversion rates that reflected differences in equipment and effectiveness. Higher pay was offered for mounted soldiers, reflecting their greater value on the battlefield. Even with these adjustments, problems persisted. Funds arrived slowly. Troops assembled late or not at all. When the ruler gathered forces at a central location, the numbers fell short of expectations, and many who did arrive were inadequately prepared. Frustration grew as the threat intensified. Eventually, the ruler abandoned the negotiated settlement and returned to the old system of universal obligation, invoking traditional penalties against those who failed to serve. This reversal underscored the tension between old legal forms and new military realities. Neither approach fully met the demands of the moment. The strain of the crisis is evident in the surviving records. Officials complained of delays, indifference, and failure to act. Letters expressed bitterness at the lack of response while enemies advanced. When the immediate danger finally subsided, efforts shifted toward collecting fines from those who had failed to fulfill their obligations. Barcelona's role during this period provides a detailed case study. The city organized recruitment through designated officials, maintained detailed financial records, and coordinated payments, equipment, transport, and communication. Funds were advanced, messengers dispatched, banners prepared, horses compensated, and soldiers paid. The city ultimately sent a smaller number of well-equipped men rather than the larger body of infantry originally required. These forces included members of the urban elite who served with retainers, as well as professional soldiers drawn from Barcelona, nearby villages, and other regions of the crown. The emphasis was clearly on quality over quantity. Financial records show that military expenses formed only a modest portion of the city's total budget. Nevertheless, the organizational effort was significant. The responsibility for defense had shifted decisively from individual obligation to collective financial management. This transformation had social consequences. Only those who could afford equipment and horses could serve directly. Others contributed indirectly through taxes or levies. military service became more exclusive, more professional, and more dependent on money. By the early 1370s, further reforms followed. Representative assemblies moved to create standing forces paid through centralized collections, limiting the ruler's ability to invoke traditional obligations. Defense became increasingly institutionalized, managed through fiscal systems rather than emergency summons. Over time, the traditional defense clause lost much of its practical importance. Its frequent use during the reign of Per III reflected a transitional moment. As warfare became more demanding and expensive, older forms of collective obligation gave way to taxation. This evolution mirrored developments elsewhere in Europe. In different kingdoms, rulers experimented with similar methods, transforming military service into a fiscal tool that extended royal authority across entire territories. In Catalonia, this process unfolded through negotiation, crisis, and adaptation. The army of Florence was leaving the city gates when an almost naked wanderer stopped in the street, watching the soldiers march past. He asked what was happening. Someone nearby told him that war had been declared against Pisa. The wanderer listened, then asked whether peace would come after the war. The reply was dismissive. Peace, he was told, was impossible now. The true struggle was only beginning. The man paused, then asked again whether peace would eventually return. He was assured that all wars end someday, but that this was not the time for peace. Then he asked a final question. Why not make peace now, before the war grows and consumes everything? The question was met with silence. The story ends with the reflection that the so-called fool had spoken wisely, and that wars might never begin, or might end early if such questions were taken seriously. Yet wars are rarely shaped by wisdom. They expand outward, drawing in lives far beyond the battlefield. Among the least visible participants in this process are women, whose lives are repeatedly disrupted by the advance and retreat of armed conflict. In the 20th century, one image briefly made this invisible labor visible. During the Second World War, American women became known through a single figure, Rosie the Riveter. When men left factories for the front lines, women entered industrial spaces, working long hours to supply weapons and equipment. Millions of women took part. When the war ended, most returned quietly to domestic life. They had not fought with rifles, yet their labor had sustained the fighting. This pattern, often seen as modern, had deep historical roots. Women in medieval Europe experienced war in ways that closely parallel those of the 20th century, though often under far harsher conditions. During the 100 Years' War, women did not choose the conflict, yet they were drawn directly into its violence. Unlike their modern counterparts, they could not retreat behind oceans or national borders. Their homes stood directly in the path of armies. The stakes were immediate and personal. During this long conflict between England and France, men fought as attackers and defenders. Women, by contrast, almost always fought as defenders. This distinction is crucial. It forces a reassessment of how medieval warfare is understood and who is recognized as a participant. War during this period rarely consisted of great battles. Instead, it unfolded through raids, sieges, and prolonged devastation of civilian life. Most military action took one of two forms. One involved rapid raids that swept across the countryside, destroying crops, burning villages, and spreading fear. These operations aimed to weaken the enemy by breaking the population's ability to survive. The other form was siege warfare. Armies surrounded fortified towns or castles, either attempting to breach the walls through force or waiting patiently for hunger to do the work. In both cases, women were deeply involved. When raids approached rural communities, women took part in preparations for flight or defense. Livestock had to be moved, food hidden, Children led to safety. Churches were transformed into makeshift fortresses. Stones were gathered. Crossbows were loaded. Boiling water was prepared. These actions did not require formal military training, but they were essential to survival. The countryside of France suffered especially. Unlike cities, villages were rarely fortified. Their inhabitants lived with constant danger. Armed groups moved unpredictably across the land, sometimes under royal banners, sometimes as independent bands of pillagers. These men were not restrained by discipline or loyalty. They struck without warning, robbed indiscriminately, and showed little mercy. Communities learned quickly that resistance often brought harsher punishment than surrender. Women faced particular dangers. Laws of chivalry offered them little real protection. Homes were burned. Food was seized. Violence against women was common, even when commanders issued orders meant to prevent it. Such orders were difficult to enforce, and soldiers were often pardoned if their service was considered valuable enough. When villages had time to prepare, women worked alongside men to defend their homes. Young women might drive animals into forests or hidden valleys. Others carried supplies or helped reinforce defences. If resistance failed, women fled with their families carrying what little they could. Survival depended not on heroism but on speed and planning and endurance. Siege warfare brought women even closer to the heart of combat. Cities under attack required every available hand. Walls had to be repaired, fires extinguished, ammunition prepared. Women carried stones, lime, pitch, and boiling liquids to the walls. They hauled debris, reinforced barricades, and tended the wounded. During moments of direct assault, they poured burning substances onto attackers, or helped push away ladders. In such moments, distinctions between civilian and soldier blurred completely. Anyone inside a resisting city was considered an enemy. If the walls fell, punishment was collective. Chroniclers describe massacres in which men, women, and children were killed without distinction. Mercy was rarely shown to populations that had resisted. Cities such as Limoges and Caen paid a terrible price for defiance. Once breaches were opened, attacking armies flooded inside. Orders were given to kill indiscriminately. People begged for mercy, but rage over resistance drowned out their pleas. Entire populations were slaughtered. Women were not spared. Their participation in defence, whether direct or indirect, marked them as legitimate targets in the eyes of the victors. Starvation sieges were no less brutal. When attackers chose to wait rather than assault, life inside the walls deteriorated slowly. Food vanished, animals were consumed, then rodents. Disease spread. Those deemed useless to defence were expelled. The poor, the elderly, women with children. These refugees were driven out and left trapped between the city and the besieging army. Many died within sight of the walls. At Calais, hundreds were expelled during winter. At Rouen, thousands. Mothers carried dead children. Children clung to dead mothers. Chroniclers describe scenes of skeletal figures collapsing from hunger. In some cases, newborn infants were pulled back into the city so they could be baptized before dying. Throughout these ordeals, women endured the same suffering as men. They defended cities, endured hunger, witnessed violence, and died in large numbers. They were not passive observers of war. They were participants bound to their communities by necessity rather than choice. War overturned social order. Farmers became fighters. Women became labourers, defenders, and leaders. In moments of crisis, traditional roles dissolved. Command could fall to anyone capable of organising resistance. Women made decisions that determined the survival of entire communities. By looking closely at these experiences, a different picture of medieval warfare emerges. War was not only fought by knights and kings, it was fought in kitchens turned into supply rooms, in churches converted into fortresses, on city walls defended by women with boiling water and stones. The boundaries between male and female roles did not disappear, but they shifted under pressure. Long before the outbreak of the 100 Years' War, women were already stepping into positions of military authority when circumstances demanded it. Across medieval Europe, territorial defence did not always rest in male hands. When lords left their lands for war, crusade, or royal service, responsibility often passed to women who remained behind. Authority was not suspended in their absence, it was transferred. Medieval literature and historical memory preserved many such examples. Stories circulated of women who ruled cities, commanded fortresses, and organised resistance. These accounts were not treated as extraordinary fantasies, but as recognisable responses to necessity. In practice, it was common for a lord to entrust his wife, sister, or mother with full control of his estates. Governance and defence were expected to continue uninterrupted. This expectation was explicit in royal correspondence. Kings departing on long campaigns did not hesitate to place the fate of entire realms in female hands. When Louis IX left France for crusade, he openly entrusted the kingdom to his mother, confident that it would be well governed and securely defended in his absence. Such declarations were not symbolic gestures. They reflected real. Similar trust appeared in noble households across England and France. A lord preparing for war might formally instruct his wife to oversee a castle's defence, coordinate supplies, command garrisons, and issue orders. These instructions left no ambiguity. The woman in charge was given power over soldiers and officers alike, with the expectation that she would act decisively and independently. Obedience to her authority was not optional. These cases reveal more than personal confidence. They show that medieval society recognised women as capable stewards of military defence when required. Managing a household alone did not automatically prepare someone to command a fortress. Yet many women clearly possess the organisational and administrative skills needed to respond to crisis. Planning, coordination, and command were already part of their daily responsibilities. Warfare merely expanded the scale. During the 100 Years' War, this pattern became more visible. Prolonged conflict meant prolonged absence. As armies moved across borders and campaigns stretched on for years, women repeatedly found themselves responsible for defending towns, castles, and regions vulnerable to attack. In some cases, these responsibilities were shared. In others, they rested entirely on one individual. Royal policy acknowledged this reality. When Edward III feared invasion while campaigning elsewhere, he issued orders directly to several noblewomen, instructing them to prepare defences, assemble armed retainers, and coordinate local resistance. These women were expected to act quickly, summon advisors, armed servants, and tenants, and stand ready to repel attack. The language used was firm and unambiguous. Hesitation would not be excused. Success would be praised. Edward placed similar trust in his queen. While he fought abroad, she governed the realm and oversaw its defence. Under her authority, threats were confronted and enemy forces defeated. Only after the danger had passed did she travel to join her husband, accepting personal risk to do so. The war itself offers striking examples of women exercising direct military leadership. On the Breton coast, a noblewoman found herself besieged while awaiting relief. Rather than retreating into passivity, she armed herself, organised her troops, and rode among them, reinforcing morale. Observing the enemy's dispositions, she identified a weakness and launched a sudden attack on their camp. Fires spread, panic followed, and the besiegers were forced to abandon their assault. The maneuver succeeded not through brute strength, but through careful observation and decisive action. Later, generations recorded similar episodes. In one English-held town under French attack, the commander's wife took control of the garrison when her husband was absent. As the situation deteriorated, she adapted her appearance and behavior to the demands of command. She dressed as a man to inspire resistance among her soldiers, then emphasized her femininity during negotiations to secure better terms. Her actions reveal a flexible understanding of authority, shaped by circumstance rather than convention. Elsewhere, ingenuity took different forms. One noblewoman escaped imprisonment by disguising herself and riding at full speed to safety, later resuming her customary dress once danger had passed. Such acts were not recorded as scandals, but as clever solutions in moments of crisis. These examples point to a broader truth about warfare in the medieval world. War disrupted ordinary life so completely that accepted social norms temporarily lost their force. Crisis created a world turned upside down. Men without arms became soldiers. Women without titles became commanders. Authority followed necessity, not gender. Chroniclers focused on dramatic cases. Yet these figures likely represent only a fraction of women who directed men, organized resistance, and made life and death decisions during wartime. Their actions were not treated as violations of order, but as practical responses to extraordinary conditions. Any discussion of women and warfare in this period must also consider the most famous example of all, Joan of Arc. No other woman of the 100 Years' War occupied such a visible place on the battlefield. Her presence has inspired centuries of debate, myth-making, and reinterpretation. To her enemies, she appeared as a dangerous heretic, driven by dark forces. To her supporters, she was a divinely inspired defender of France. Over time, her image shifted from condemned rebel to sanctified hero. Yet behind these interpretations lies a more complex reality. Joan saw herself not as a warrior in the conventional sense, but as an instrument of divine will. Her goal was singular: to expel foreign forces and secure the crown for the rightful king. She issued challenges to enemy commanders, with absolute conviction declaring her mission ordained by God. At the same time, she relied heavily on experienced captains to plan and execute military operations. Contemporary observers acknowledge this balance. While she inspired troops and transformed morale, seasoned soldiers remained essential to success. Yet even critics admitted that she possessed a natural authority on the battlefield, behaving as though war had always been her calling. Joan's understanding of her role placed her outside ordinary categories. She rejected conventional femininity, enforced strict moral discipline among her soldiers, and demanded religious observance before battle. In conduct and appearance, she resembled a religious devotee more than a soldier. By dedicating herself entirely to divine service, she stepped beyond traditional gender boundaries. Her choice of clothing became a central issue. Practical needs first led her to adopt male attire, but she continued to wear it long after capture, insisting that this too followed divine instruction. To some, this marked her as neither man nor woman, but something separate, set apart by purpose. Throughout her life, emphasis was placed on her chastity and restraint. Accounts suggest that she avoided direct killing, allowing her to pursue her mission without violating moral commandments. Her identity merged religious devotion with military leadership in a form that contemporaries understood through familiar spiritual traditions. Joan's story, while exceptional, does not stand apart from the wider pattern. She fought not as a conqueror, but as a defender. She embodied the same role occupied by countless other women during the war, though on a far larger stage. When the conflict is viewed as a whole, a consistent picture emerges. Women rarely appeared as attackers, yet they were deeply involved in defense. They endured sieges, organized resistance, sustained communities, and suffered the same brutal consequences as men when defenses failed. In many cases, they paid with their lives. Although male warriors dominated the offensive side of warfare, women formed the backbone of survival. They defended homes, cities, and kingdoms. They labored, commanded, and resisted. The image of the woman sustaining war from behind the lines is not a modern invention. It is centuries old. During the 100 Years' War, the Armagnac faction framed its struggle not simply as a political conflict, but as a moral and spiritual mission. The war was understood as a fight to restore the French kingdom, to free it from foreign domination, and to protect a sacred royal lineage believed to be divinely sanctioned. This vision did not remain confined to royal courts or learned circles. It spread widely, shaping how soldiers, poets, clergy, women, and common people understood the violence surrounding them. Over time, this belief system helped form a shared sense of identity and purpose, transforming war into a collective act of resistance infused with religious meaning. This worldview did not rely primarily on legal arguments about succession or dynastic claims. Instead, it drew strength from a conviction that justice itself would intervene in history. Many believed that God actively guided events, rewarding righteousness and punishing injustice. This belief gave rise to a powerful sense of unity, cutting across social divisions. Farmers, nobles, clergy, and townspeople increasingly saw themselves as participants in a shared struggle for moral restoration. From this atmosphere emerged a new political consciousness that emphasized language, culture, community, and responsibility to the collective good. Within this context, the rise of Joan of Arc became possible. Her appearance challenged social expectations and redefined who could act as an agent of divine justice. A young, uneducated peasant woman came to embody a national cause, not through lineage or learning, but through conviction. Her story resonated because it aligned perfectly with a belief already taking root, that justice did not depend on power or status, but on moral purpose. In the early 15th century, the Armagnac movement became the strongest supporter of the Valois dynasty. Its followers believed that victory would ultimately belong to France because divine justice favoured their cause. Official propagandists attempted to defend this position through legal reasoning, but their influence remained limited. Many people felt disconnected from abstract arguments about law and inheritance. Instead, support for the French cause grew from a more instinctive belief that suffering had meaning and that deliverance would come through divine action. This belief did not originate in scholarly texts. It spread through sermons, stories, songs, and shared experiences of hardship. It found its clearest expression in Joan of Arc, whose actions gave form to ideas that many already held. She did not present legal theories or political treatises. She spoke in simple terms about justice, obedience, and divine will. That simplicity made her message accessible and powerful. Alongside Joan, several figures helped shape this ideology in different ways. Writers, preachers, and thinkers framed war as an instrument of moral correction. They argued that victory did not belong to the strongest army, but to those who acted with discipline and purpose. Suffering was understood not as meaningless destruction, but as a form of purification. Defeat could serve as punishment for wrongdoing, while victory signaled divine approval. These ideas drew from older Christian traditions that had long attempted to reconcile faith with violence. War was seen as tragic, but sometimes necessary, permitted only when aimed at restoring peace and correcting injustice. Violence was to be restrained, purposeful, and directed by legitimate authority. Within this framework, war became an extension of moral responsibility, rather than a rejection of it. Joan of Arc embodied these principles in practice. She sought approval from royal authority before acting. She offered peace before battle. She framed violence as a last resort rather than a goal. She carried a banner instead of a weapon, avoiding direct killing. She discouraged looting and excess. These actions reinforced the perception that her mission was guided by restraint and justice rather than vengeance. Her victories reinforced a powerful belief that divine justice favoured the morally right, even against overwhelming odds. When French forces succeeded under her leadership, it was widely interpreted as proof that righteousness outweighed military strength. When defeats had occurred earlier in the war, they were explained as punishment for moral failure rather than evidence of injustice in the cause itself. This interpretation helped people endure prolonged hardship. It allowed suffering to be understood as part of a larger process of redemption. War became a test, not only of armies, but of collective virtue. Individuals were encouraged to confess, repent, and reform, believing that moral renewal would bring political deliverance. Joan's capture and execution revealed the limits of this unity. Divisions within France remained deep, and not all accepted her authority or vision. Her death demonstrated that belief alone could not immediately overcome political fragmentation. Yet, her impact endured. After the war turned decisively in France's favour, attention returned to her legacy. A formal effort was launched to clear her name and reassess her trial. Witnesses from across the kingdom testified to her character, faith, and conduct. Their statements reveal how deeply her mission had shaped public consciousness. Many described her arrival as a moment of hope during a time of despair, a sign that deliverance had come from beyond human power. Church authorities reviewing her case emphasized her discipline, restraint, and obedience. They argued that her actions aligned with long-standing moral principles governing war. She had acted with proper authority, pursued a just cause, and maintained a clear intention to restore peace. In their view, her mission reflected divine will rather than personal ambition. This reassessment solidified an interpretation of the war that placed moral purpose at its centre. France's victory was understood not simply as a political outcome, but as a moral resolution. The belief emerged that the French, at the heart of this belief, was a paradox. The enemy was Christian, not foreign in faith. Killing fellow believers posed a moral dilemma. Different voices offered different resolutions. Some hoped for reconciliation and unity against external threats. Others believed that defeat itself could serve as spiritual correction for the aggressor. In this view, loss became a form of redemption. Joan's position was uncompromising. She focused on expulsion, not reconciliation. Her mission did not emphasize shared identity, but moral boundary. This stance contributed both to her power and her downfall. Yet it also reflected the intensity of belief that defined the Armagnac movement at its peak. Over time, the idea of France as a chosen nation took hold. The kingdom was imagined as uniquely favoured, entrusted with defending faith and justice. Attacks against it were seen as assaults on moral order itself. Victory, therefore, carried universal meaning beyond borders. This ideology did not vanish with the war's end. It shaped how later generations understood authority, responsibility, and restraint in conflict. It emphasized discipline over aggression and justice over conquest. It suggested that power must answer to moral judgment. Joan of Arc's legacy lies not only in battlefield victories, but in how her story reshaped ideas of leadership and legitimacy. She demonstrated that conviction could rival force, that restraint could define strength, and that moral clarity could mobilize a society. Through her, war was framed not as domination, but as a struggle to restore balance in a broken world. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 marked a decisive turning point in the Hundred Years' War and shaped the political and military balance of Western Europe for decades. The victory gave Henry V immense authority and psychological advantage, discouraging French leaders from risking further open battles. As a result, English forces were able to advance steadily in northern France, capturing towns and fortresses and later securing the conquest of Normandy. The destruction of much of the French military elite and the shock of defeat made English power the dominant concern of the period. The march from Harfleur to Calais, often described as reckless, was in fact a calculated strategic decision. Henry V was an experienced commander who understood that without a decisive battlefield victory, his invasion could fail. Medieval warfare strongly favoured defenders who avoided battle, and only a clear military triumph could force France to accept major concessions. Confident in the discipline, cohesion, and leadership of his army, Henry deliberately moved in a way that forced the French either to allow his passage or to confront him under conditions he believed he could control. Although Henry moved quickly and travelled light, this did not mean he feared battle. Speed reduced the risk of encirclement, starvation, and strategic containment, which posed a greater danger than open combat. Reports of negotiations before the battle do not prove that he wished to avoid fighting, but rather suggest caution against being trapped. When the French finally chose to fight, the result confirmed Henry's judgment. Agincourt shattered French confidence and made the later English successes in France possible. The later discussion challenges the idea that early gunpowder weapons automatically made medieval fortifications obsolete. Campaigns led by the Duke of Burgundy show that even massive artillery forces often failed to break traditional stone walls. Towns such as Compiègne and Calais resisted prolonged bombardment, while successful sieges depended as much on morale, discipline, and organisation as on technology. Only in specific conditions did artillery produce decisive results.